The Tim Heale Podcasts. Ordinary people's extraordinary stories.
Welcome to the Tim Heale Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to have a chat with Terry. Terry's going to tell me where and when he was born, and he's going to describe what it was like, where he grew up, the schools he went to, and the education that he received. Okay, Terry, off to you.
Thanks, Tim. My name is Terry Thiele, and I was born in 1954 in a small town, Bedford, Ohio, in the States, just outside of Cleveland. And my upbringing, I'd say, was pretty standard for American Midwestern families of the time. I had two brothers, one 7 years older, one 7 years younger. And living in that small town, going to the local public schools. If you're at all familiar, there's a famous illustrator, Norman Rockwell, who used to do the cover paintings for the Saturday Evening Post, which was an American magazine during the 40s through the 70s. And Rockwell was well known for picking the sort of idyllic, quintessential American scenes. And I sometimes think I was raised in a Norman Rockwell illustration. It was pretty idyllic. I had the good fortune to attend a private boys' school as a scholarship student from in the States, grades 9 through 12. And that made an enormous impact on me because in some respects, it introduced me to a socioeconomic class in America that my parents didn't belong to. And that was an invaluable learning experience in and of itself. I spent 1 year at the United States Military Academy, going after high school, but I elected to resign because I discovered the academy had let me in on a waiver on my eyesight. But I rapidly discovered during bayonet training that they had made a mistake. I had my glasses knocked off and was promptly beaten to death because I couldn't see my attacker. So I ultimately did wind up in the United States Army Reserves, but I did not graduate from West Point. Instead, I transferred to Princeton University, which is a liberal arts school, and studied history. And upon graduating from Princeton, it's one of those classic things you don't quite know what you're going to do with your life. And I stood in front of a mailbox with two envelopes. And one envelope was to apply to work on an archaeological dig on Hadrian's Wall. And the other was to take the necessary tests to go to law school. So you could tell I was very confused as to what I was going to do next. But I eventually wound up going to New York University School of Law and received my JD in 1979. And then I started in on my career. And at the time, 1979, well, I had been raised in the Cold War. That was a period where at any given moment, the world could come to an end. I don't think young people today appreciate that. And I got a job working in the United States Treasury Department's legal office. And over the next 11 years, worked for the government, first at Treasury, where I got into national security work. And being in national security, I wound up working at the Central Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and my final posting was in the Executive Office of the President. During the end of the Reagan administration and the beginning of the Bush administration. And it's a classic case. It sort of speaks to why I wrote my book. When you start your career and you think you know what you're going to do, um, and I enjoyed working in national security very much. I enjoyed the people I worked with. I enjoyed the mission. It felt like it was something that was worth doing. And at the time, I figured, well, there's always going to be a Cold War, so I've got a career. I'll do this forever. Well, of course, in 1989, um, the Berlin Wall comes down, and in 1990, the flag comes off of the Kremlin. And at that point, all of the appropriations for intelligence work vanished. And I discovered that, in fact, there wasn't always going to be a Cold War. We actually won. So I tell people it's a natural career progression from fighting the Cold War to going to work for a refrigerator manufacturer, which I did. I went and worked for General Electric for a number of years, doing government relations, regulatory, and environmental work. After that, I spent 4 or 5 years working for AB Electrolux, a Swedish conglomerate, again, another appliance manufacturer, doing regulatory work, which by definition, a lot of it was environmental. And then finally, he spent 20 years in a specialty chemical company, Lubrizol Corporation, that manufactures basically molecules. There isn't a car out on the street that doesn't have Lubrizol chemistry in it. Lubrizol would sell it to the major oil companies. And again, I was doing strategic planning, regulatory type work for Lubrizol over those 20 years. In 2018, I sort of semi-retired, and I've been teaching, doing some consulting work, and I finally got around to writing my book, which I'd been thinking about for the preceding 40, 50 years. And that's how I got to where I am today.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is just to take you back now and look at some of the stuff that you did. So we brushed over your school years fairly quickly. So what did you do in high school? What high school did you go to? Was it you went to you got
it was a private boys' school in Cleveland, Ohio. University School was its name. And I was active in sports, although I wasn't very good. I played soccer, year football, and baseball and track. But I was a mediocre athlete.
Is that where you got your scholarship in?
Yes, I did. It was an academic scholarship. And I was actively involved in high school theater and high school, the student body political system. You know, I wound up actually being president of my class.
Hey. I guess that's something that quite a lot of kids aspire to.
Well, it was a small school. We only had I want to say 86 boys in my graduating class, and again, it was interesting because I came from a what I would consider a very middle class background, and at the time, most of the students in this school were from a wealthier segment of the population. So for me, I learned a lot in the classroom, but I also learned a lot just from being in that socioeconomic environment. It was a real departure.
So at the end of that, once you graduated, you say you went to West Point.
I did. And I went for 1 year, but The
What
problem
was
there
your
was
experience like?
I simply didn't feel that physically be given my eyesight, notwithstanding the fact that they had given me a waiver,
Mm.
that I could operate. Well, here's the situation: you're a second lieutenant in charge of a platoon, and you're out in the middle of the woods, and you're responsible for keeping these guys alive. And I get my glasses knocked off, and I'm not worth much of anything to anybody at that point.
Wandering around in
And
the early.
it wasn't fitting
Mm.
into what I thought I could accomplish, and so I resigned my commission. Now, subsequently, I did
So,
participate in
so
the U.S.
just
Army Reserve as a lawyer, as a what they call a judge advocate general. So I
mm.
spent 15 years in U.S. Army Reserve as a JAG lawyer.
So can I just take you back to West Point? So the year you went in, and what was the curriculum like at that time? Because I guess it was a two-year college
Four
course.
year, four
Four,
year
4 years at West Point.
academic, very analogous to our civilian universities in terms of the curriculum. So we're heavy on engineering.
Yeah.
It was a Bachelor of Science, not a Bachelor of Arts degree. But I was taking engineering, math, language, English, history, and of course military science. But more or less the same sort of curriculum that you would see at American Public University,
Oh,
but
right.
for basic training in the summer, and
Yeah.
all of the military laid on top of everything else.
Yeah. So you've got the normal sort of academic curriculum that you would
Yeah,
get at a normal university.
yeah,
Um, so I guess you were paid for because you were essentially in the military. So
yes.
that.
Actually, my parents weren't particularly enamored with the thought that I resigned my commission because I was getting half a second lieutenant's pay while I was at West Point, and then I proceeded to go to Princeton University, which at the time, 1973, the tuition was $6,000, which was quite a hefty chunk of change at the time. So, from a financial standpoint, they weren't too happy with me, but
So I guess if you'd have done like the 4 years at West Point, you would have had to sign on for at least 4 years. Is it after that return of
at the
service?
time, if you stayed for a minimum of 2 years, as soon as you completed that second year, you picked up a service obligation. And at the time, it was for an additional 5 years of service, is my recollection.
Hmm.
But of course, most of my classmates uh, would stay to become career officers. The irony, the ultimate irony in it all, is then going to work for the Treasury Department and then working in national security. I was selected to attend the National War College in 1986, 87. Full year program populated by Army colonels, Air Force colonels, lieutenant colonels, Navy captains, State Department Foreign Service officers, and a sprinkling of participants from intelligence community agencies like Treasury, which was why I was attending. And the ultimate irony was that I discovered once I got there, and of course at the time I was in the Army Reserves, which really had nothing to do with my day job.
Hmm.
Um, I went into the War College as a first lieutenant in the Army Reserves as a JAG officer, and I discovered that I had beaten my West Point class to the War College by 10 years. Um, that my classmates at West Point wouldn't get there for another decade. So I short circuited the process. Uh, and of course, no one really at the War College knew what to do with me because I was the one guy from the Treasury Department. And most everyone else acted and appeared senior to me. And at the end of the year, as it turned out, I was promoted to captain in the Army Reserves. And so I asked the commandant, Navy Admiral, and during the course of the year, many of my classmates who had received promotions had their promotions recognized in the auditorium at the beginning of the day, promotion ceremonies. So the very last week of school, I show up. I've been the Treasury Department guy the whole time. They don't know who I am or where did he come from. And the very last week of school, I show up in uniform as a first lieutenant because that day I was going to have my promotion ceremony at the War College to captain. Of course, everybody right then knew, well, now I know where you fit. Clearly, I know where you fit now.
So all the time you could have been making the tea for them.
Exactly,
Lucky all the way through.
Would you go get my car?
So I just want to take you back slightly. So you resign your commission in West Point, and how soon after did you transfer into the reserves?
Well, I went into the reserves the first year I was working at the Treasury Department because, in effect, what I was doing is I was entering the Judge Advocate General Corps, the lawyers of the Army, and so I had to complete my education and be pass the bar and become a lawyer before I could become a JAG officer. So I left West Point in '73, finished college, finished law school, and then I entered the Army Reserves in 1979. I think it was 1979 or early '80 when I first started working, because at that point I was now a lawyer. I'd be accepted in the JAG Corps.
So that's what you were doing. You were doing your law degree there.
No, Princeton was strictly undergraduate. That was I spent 3 years at Princeton. I got a Bachelor of Arts in History, and then I went to law school and spent 3 years in law school in New York. So it was a 6-year period between leaving West Point and when I started employment at the Treasury.
And your parents sort of funded you through this all the way through, or?
Well, I was working too, but yes, there was a certain amount of begrudged funding going on.
Well, they did have you after all, didn't they?
It was their fault. So, if you didn't want to do this, you shouldn't have, once you start down the road, you got to finish the journey.
So you 79, then you joined the reserves. You went in as an officer?
For second lieutenant.
Yeah. So what was the training like for that? Did you have to go back to do a short course at West Point? Or?
Well, actually, no, because I had completed basic training at West Point. And so that prior experience, in effect, qualified me for receiving a commission without having to go on active duty for any period of time. And I spent the next 15 years basically, reservists are sort of known as weekend warriors. You are in a particular unit, and you'll go for over the weekend, and then for a month or two in the summer. on and off. And the challenge, of course, was um, at the same time I was working in national security in my civilian job, which in some respects took precedence over anything I would be doing in the reserves. So I wound up with scheduling problems all the time, uh, and then ultimately, having attended the National War College as a civilian, really ruined my reserve career, because there is a natural progression in the American military. As you progress in rank, you also progress through different schools. So there is the Army, there's the Command and General Staff School, there's the Army War College. So there's a sort of a pyramid of schools that you would attend as you increased in rank.
Yeah.
And when you became a lieutenant colonel or a colonel in the Army, then you would be considered, if you were one of the select, to go to the National War College. Well, here I am as a first lieutenant in the National War College. So after I graduated, the people that were responsible for handling all the reservists, they really didn't know what to do with me, because as I went to first lieutenant, then I became a captain. Well, there's not much point in sending you to the Army National, Army War College or Command and General. You've already done the National War College. We're not going backwards. We can't, So we'll just put you over here in the corner, and we'll worry about you later. So that's more or less what happened. Yeah.
And so go from captain straight up to colonel.
It didn't work out. Or at least they didn't see it that way. So.
Yeah. So you kind of did 15 years pretty much as a captain then?
Yeah.
And why did you leave?
Well, it simply got to the point where this was in the 90s. I'd been in for 15 years. Basically, it was family issues. I had 3 kids. I was working at the time I was working for General Electric, doing a lot of travel. And I wasn't going anywhere with the reserve career, and it became too much of a hassle in some respects. I didn't think I was contributing much, and I wasn't getting much out of it. So I figured it was a good time to make room. And the other thing was the Army at the time was trying to winnow down the number of reserve officers. So we came to a mutual agreement that I had served my time, and I should go find something else to do.
Fair one. Did you do any operational tours at all in your time there?
Not on the military side. The more interesting, actually, and again, it came back to conflicts with when I was in the government. I spent a fair amount of time doing foreign travel around intelligence-related issues because of my role in national security. So I went to West Berlin a number of times, and a number of other countries for different reasons. And again, that tended to take precedence over anything that I would have been doing with the reserves.
Well, West Berlin was my favorite posting ever. We went there in 1978 to 1980. We did pretty much 2.5 years in Berlin, and it was a fantastic tour. The wall was still up. Rudolf Hess was alive. We had some really, really interesting duties. We had the British military train that used to go from sort of Charlottenburg down to Brunswick every day. And people would actually pay you to go and do that duty. you give somebody 10 marks to get on that duty, because it was a cracking day out.
Yeah. Yeah.
We used to go over to East Berlin a lot through Checkpoint Charlie. We used to have big Opel Imperials cars, and we drive around there like big limousines. And we go through Checkpoint Charlie, and you pick your tail up, whether it's a East German or it was a Russian, and they'd just follow you around all day, and you stop off at various places you had to visit. You know, you went to the Russian Museum, the tomb of the Russian tomb of the unknown soldier. You stop at a couple of cafes, and that was just sort of showing the flag, and then you come
Right.
back over.
Right. Well, when I was at the War College, the spring term, the class was divided into teams, and my group, we were focusing on a deep analysis of, at the time, NATO. And so we spent 3 weeks, I want to say, traveling around Western Europe, looking, going to different NATO facilities, receiving briefings, and then again took the night train to West Berlin. Had the obligatory series of briefings, and then we turned in our government passports for civilian passports and got on a tourist bus. And we had a tour guide, and the bus driver was GRU. I mean, he was, clearly an intelligence, East German intelligence. And we spent 5 or 6 days driving around East Germany on this tour bus. And I remember seeing the East German countryside and the dramatic difference between East Germany and West Germany at the time. And in Leipzig, we stayed at what they called a Deutschmark hotel, because if you were an East German and you were able to come across Western currency, the only place you could turn it in or buy anything with it was at the Deutschmark hotel.
Yeah.
And normally in a very nice hotel, you go into the gift shop and there's jewelry and watches and scarves and handbags and that sort of stuff. Well, they had drill bits and faucets were in the display cases in the gift shop, because if you were an East German and you wanted to get a toaster, if you wanted to get anything from the West, like a toaster that actually worked, you went to the Deutschmark hotel and turned in your currency to get it. It was a bit of a shock. It's a bit of a shock.
Well, say we used to drive down through what we called the corridor from Potsdam to Brunswick, and when we used to go through Checkpoint Charlie to go into East Berlin, for us it was like going from a colour film to a black and white film in sepia.
Yeah. Well, and what shocked me at the time, of course, this was the 80s, was the amount of war damage from the Second World War that still existed. So when we drove through Dresden, the old Royals residence, whatever it was called, I forget the name of it. It was a pile of rubble, and there were trees growing up through it, and it was just shocking how evident, how near that history was. You could feel it in a way that in the West it had become history, but here it was very much present.
Well, it's because they hadn't rebuilt a lot of it.
Yeah.
And it was your fault. I mean, you did it. You flattened Dresden.
Yep.
They've only got yourself.
Along with a number of other cities.
So moving on then from a national intelligence agency and the CIA, that work must have been quite interesting at times.
It was. It was also very frustrating. Obviously, you can't necessarily talk about it, but uh, the the challenges of getting people to pay attention to the right things, um, and resourcing was always a concern. I remember at one point when I was at the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is in the Department of Defense and focuses on military intelligence. One of the I was the actually I was the legal advisor to what was known as the DoD Human Manager, and he was responsible for all human intelligence activities undertaken by the Department of Defense, and I was his lawyer. And I remember one of the officers commenting that the Warsaw Pact intelligence resources outnumbered us 6 to 1, 8 to 1, something like that, boots on the ground. And of course that was very troubling. But then he said, well, but the good news is that probably 3/4 of the resources is devoted to following their own people around. Which
it's funny you say about being a league ad. One of my jobs was I spent 10 years in psychological operations, and everything we did had to go through a process. So I had to go to the legal officer, the political officer, before it could get passed up the chain to the commander to sign off.
Mhm.
So lots of times I had to go to the legal officer, explain why we've done a particular product, and the way we've done it that way is to be able to have this type of influence on the target audience, and we didn't do it that
Right.
way because it wouldn't work. So
Yeah, for a short period of time, I had legal oversight of all human clandestine operations directed against the Warsaw Pact.
Hmm.
And in some respects, it ruined my civilian career. And I say that because when you're doing that kind of work, I was never in harm's way. But there were people on these projects and activities that were in harm's way. They were doing things cross border that if they had been caught, it would have been serious repercussions for them. And after you do that for a while, the phone rings, or at the time I had a beeper. The beeper goes off and you jump out of your skin because you want to make sure that nothing horrible has happened. Then you leave government service and you go to, let's say, General Electric is where I first worked.
Yeah.
And the general counsel for whom I worked was very impressed with himself. And at different points, he would try to impress upon me, what you're working on, this is very important. And my reaction was, I'm making washing machines and refrigerators. It's an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. It'll be on my desk in the morning. What I used to work on, that was important. This, not so much, And so I think continuously berated for not taking my job seriously enough. Because I simply couldn't. This.
I had a conversation yesterday with a Falklands vet, and we were saying exactly the same sort of thing. He was down the Falklands on a ship. They came back. They went into Portsmouth. They had a refit, and then they were sent straight out onto an exercise up in Norway, and it just wasn't the same as being on operations.
Yeah.
Somebody wasn't trying to shoot at you and stuff like that. So, and lots of guys in the military join the military to go on operations. When they come back off of operations, normal units, and then go off on a normal sort of an exercise and get totally disillusioned and put the papers in and leave.
Right.
Because they don't get the same buzz out of what they get on operations where their life's in danger. So I guess it's the same sort of thing.
Well, and there's a gravitas. I mean, there's a seriousness of purpose that I wouldn't, certainly it's a jolt, but it focuses the mind. You're doing something that has a consequence, as opposed to, look, guys, we're building washing machines and refrigerators. They'll be there tomorrow. Nobody's going to die over this. Relax. Oh, well.
It's a horses for courses, isn't it?
Yeah. Afraid so.
General Electrics. So where did you move on after that?
I was at GE for 4 or 5 years. And we were living, my wife and I, we had 3 kids, and we were living in Kentucky, which is in the along the Mississippi River in the central part of the country. And interestingly enough, I wanted to send my 2 sons to the school that I had attended back in Ohio, the private school I had gone to. So I left General Electric and worked for a competitor, AB Electrolux, also an appliance manufacturer, because they happened to have their North American headquarters back in Cleveland, which was in the area where so I left GE to move back to Ohio, exclusively for the purpose of sending our 2 boys to the school, and they both did graduate from that high school. And after spending a number of years with Electrolux, I simply, within the Cleveland area, changed to Lubrizol, which is this specialty chemical company.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, because of Lubrizol, Lubrizol has one of their major facilities outside of Derby. And so I've spent a considerable amount of time in England going back and forth. I had some people who worked for me who were in Derby, and got to the point where I could drive a stick shift on the wrong side of the road without killing anybody, that I will admit to.
Excellent. So it takes a bit of doing.
Well, you've got to pay attention.
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't want to sort of lapse back into automatic, because it won't work. So.
It's that sudden realization you put your foot on the brake and you're still in gear.
Yeah. What I found interesting is I was scared to death of having to, because I normally I've had a Mini Cooper for years, and driving a stick where I'm shifting with my right, and then going to England and shifting with my left. I thought that was going to be the issue, and the shift wasn't it. It was steering with my right hand, because normally I steer with my left. That was the awkward thing, was steering, and I'm weaving around there.
Brilliant. So that kind of brings us up to date then. So
about 3 years ago, I retired from Lubrizol, and during the course of the past 10, 15 years, on the side, I would teach strategic planning type courses at a number of the universities in the Ohio area. And since I've retired, we moved down here. We now live in North Carolina, closer to the ocean, simply so that we've got 9 grandchildren. And I've got 3 of them in Northern Virginia. 3 of them are just a couple hours north of us. That's where I'm sitting now. And we've got 4 and we've got two down in Florida. And I can now get to all three sets of grandchildren without having to get on an airplane. Because I have over 1 million miles flying on United Airlines alone, just from business travel. And if I don't have to get on another airplane ever again, I'll be very happy.
I'm exactly the same. The army put me off flying, flying me into places where it goes totally dark and you're doing a tactical landing in the dark, and they're throwing the thing around, or they'll stick you on a helicopter to go up country somewhere where there's some real hostiles that's likely to shoot you. That takes the fun out of flying a bit.
Well, I've just found, frankly, over the years, people on airplanes have become so rude, so impolite, boorish, that it's taken all the joy out of travel for me. And again, if I'm in my car, I'm a classic American. I drive everywhere. Okay.
Excellent. So you kind of now retired. You do a little bit of lecturing. I retired myself in 2018. So this is what I've got into.
Well, it's funny. The reason I started doing, I've been doing a number of these podcasts, and of course, I'm a baby boomer, so all of this technology is hard for me to handle. I have to get my grandchildren to work it out for me. But I did spend the past 40, 50 years, dealing with both in the military, national security, and in corporate America. The thing, and I go back to when I was figuring I had a career because there was always going to be a Cold War.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden we won. It really demonstrated for me the uncertainty of life and the need to plan, to do good planning, to think strategically about the future. And I've been mulling that over for the past 40 years. And that's when I finally retired. I had the time and the leisure to actually write the book that I wrote. And it's arguing that I'll give you the short version. I would argue that as a species, we are entering what I'll call our fourth age.
Yeah.
Our first age was from about 200,000 years ago, 200,000 BC, to about 10,000 BC, and we were hunter-gatherers. From 10,000 BC to, I'll say, 1785, we were farmers and herders primarily. Now, I picked 1785 because that's when steam powered industry, steam engines became commercially available in England that were reliable. So it was beginning of the industrial age. The third age was the industrial age from about 1785, and I picked 2020 as sort of the endpoint, is when we made things, we manufactured. And I'm arguing that we are in the process of entering an entirely new and different fourth age that's driven by two sets of disruptions. That over that time from 200,000 years ago, the rate and the degree of change have accelerated to the point now where it's going like this. On the societal side, when you think about demographics, for the first time ever, more people live in cities than in the country. Everybody's worried about population explosions, but when you look at the UN data, even the UN says that by the end of the century, the world's population is going to peak and then start to decline. But there are a lot of demographic experts who are pointing out that because we now live in cities, our populations are going to decline. We're going to peak and decline sooner, several billion people less than what's expected. And in fact, at the present time, half of the countries of the world aren't reproducing. They're below population reproduction levels. Eastern Europe, Japan, South Korea are forecast to lose 40% of their population. 95% of the UN's population growth forecast, 95% of that, it's all Africa.
Mm.
The only countries that look to be holding their own from a population standpoint are the Anglo-Saxon countries, United Kingdom, Ireland, Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand. In part because our reproduction levels are a little bit higher, but also because that's where everybody wants to move.
Yeah, don't we know it?
Yeah.
I don't know whether you see it on your news, but we've got a problem with illegal migrants crossing the English Channel.
Oh, it's a big deal here in the States, illegal migration over the border from Mexico. But the point is, everybody's worried. All of our policy people are thinking about a world of increasing population. Nobody's thinking about a world of decreasing population. And that's the near future. And once those populations start to decline, they don't stop. That's a pretty profound change. Now, layer on top of that some other interesting demographic facts. The Chinese have already topped out their population and they're beginning to decline. They're getting older. But because of their one-child policy, which was in place for a generation, there are now 25 million Chinese men for which there are no Chinese women. Because during that one-child policy, people preferred to having male babies over female babies. Now, in India, for different cultural reasons, the same thing has happened, preferring male babies over female babies to the point where it's not 25 million, it's 80 million Indian men for which there are no Indian women. Now, if you want to talk about political destabilization, that's an awful lot of testosterone out there with nothing to do.
Right.
So we are looking at a world that, on the demographic societal side, is destabilizing. And on the technological side, we have so many disruptive technologies: 3D printing, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, new materials, cheap, ubiquitous off-grid energy, just to name a few, that are all coming together at the same time. And I would argue what they're doing is they are taking that third age model of mass production and they are obsolescing it. We are going from a world of where relatively few are making thousands to a world of where thousands are making a few. The ability to customize local production efficiently, cost effectively, is being enabled by all of these technologies. And so the whole business model that we've had for the past, since 1785, everybody's planning around that, but that's not the future. And so here's the troubling fact. There was a Swedish gentleman, passed away a couple of years ago, Hans Rosling, wrote a book 2-3 years ago. And in it, what he was describing was what he discovered about the state of knowledge among people of the world. He first did a survey at Davos of our sort of ruling elite. And then he went on and interviewed people, I want to say, 12,000 people in 17 countries. And he had a 13 question survey. And each question had 3 possible answers, A, B, C. The net result was, as he put it, if you had had a troop of monkeys randomly taking this test, they would have randomly assigned all 3 equally, 33%. Our population as a whole doesn't know the state of the world. These questions about what's the state of child education globally, what's the state of poverty, what's the state of urbanization, these are basic strategic issues. And the population, and especially the ruling elite at Davos, scored worse than a troop of monkeys. Now, if these are the people that are setting our policies and they don't know the facts, they're assuming that the world is something other than what it really is, then it's no surprise that we're seeing the dissatisfaction that we see in our politics these days. And so the gist of the book, and I'm writing it for my grandchildren, is to raise these issues. And I've just sort of hit the top of some of them. But to raise these, I'm no genius, I'm no prophet. But I do know how to do strategic planning. I do know how to do scenario planning. And the point I'm making in the book is, we're looking at the wrong things. We're worrying about the wrong things. We need to get the facts right, and we need to think about these trends, both societal and technological. And here's the ultimate reason why. I'm going to go back 200,000 years. I would argue that we all are driven by instinct. And I've picked 4. The first of which is, as a species, we are afraid of everything. Everything scares us to death. That's what we learned 200,000 years ago. So it's going to eat me. And when we are afraid, we tend to overreact violently. We do this all the time. Second thing, we discovered that our ability to find a mate to pass on our genes and to survive is improved when we live in groups. So we are very societal animals. We spend about 20% of every day socializing in one form or another. Now, 200,000 years ago, that 20% was spent picking fleas out of your neighbor's fur. We don't do that anymore, but we're still constantly socializing. So we live in groups. 3, within a group, we will do anything to improve our status, because that means we're likely to get a better mate and we improve our chances of surviving. So we will lie, cheat, steal, whatever, to move up that pyramid. 4th, we are curious. Now, it's not in any kind of BBC special version of we're, wondering about the universe. We are curious about what's over the hill, and we want to know about it because we don't want it to eat us. That's why we're curious. It goes back to the fearful thing, okay? I would argue that those instincts drive everything that we do. And there's a traditional psychological view that we have our modern rational brain and our back primitive brain, and the purpose of the rational brain is to keep that primitive brain under control so it doesn't do anything crazy. Well, the best current thinking on that says really the purpose of the rational modern brain is to come up with a very good story to tell to our group about why it is we're going to do what our primitive brain wants us to do. So we're really driven by instincts. Now, over the past 200,000 years, as we evolved and developed societies and cultures, we developed a set of tools and processes and social mores to help guide us so that we're not killing each other constantly. But here is the problem with the fourth age. If you think about any child who has existed since the 200,000 years ago, 7,000 generations, something like that, that child could look at their parents and their grandparents and say, my life is going to look something like what their lives look like. It may be a little bit different, but if they were farmers, I'm going to be a farmer. If they were a laborer, I'm going to be a laborer. And I can use that as a template to figure out what the future is going to look like for me. So I'm not scared of it as much. Well, I would argue with all of the disruptions that I mentioned, kids today, there's nothing I can tell as a baby boomer, my grandchildren, about how I grew up, the world I lived in that I was describing to you, that's going to have any value to help them cope with a world we simply can't even imagine going forward. So if they're on their own and they got to try and figure out living in a world that we simply can't imagine because it's changing so quickly, they're going to fall back on those instincts. And if it's chaotic and you become fearful, we overreact violently.
I think we've had a pretty good demonstration of that fear factor over the last couple of years with this pandemic that we've had. The governments around the world have been instilling fear into the population, and now we're coming to effectively the end of it. And now the government's got the bigger problem of trying to convince people that it's okay to take masks in public. It's okay to go and mix somewhere. You're not going to die from this unless you're over 80.
Well, what I find fascinating here in the States is the fear of the vaccination. That the significant percentage of the population refuses to be vaccinated. And I think back to, okay, when you were growing up, didn't you receive, countless vaccinations as a child for measles, mumps, chickenpox, and some really nasty diseases that don't exist anymore because of those vaccinations? And that was okay, and you were comfortable and confident, but now you're afraid. And it's troubling.
I think it comes down to that fear factor again.
Yeah.
The government's put this fear factor in, and people don't trust them anymore. And I think that's the biggest problem.
Well, and given the fact that they don't know the facts, that they're operating off of the wrong information, maybe there's good reason to be a little concerned.
So anyway, Terry, what's the title of your book? Is it published yet?
It is. The title of the book is Our Fourth Age, a Village Elder's Story for Young Homines Sapientes About Their Future History. And it's on Amazon in the UK. Now,
and is it on Audible?
Yes, it is. So paperback, Audible, and hardback. Now, in the title, I've used homines sapientes, and you're going to say, well, what does that mean?
Homo sapiens.
And I used it as a lesson. In the original draft, I had young Homo sapiens. And then I sent a draft to a number of professors to comment. One of them was a classics professor. I think he actually did the seminal translation of the ancient Sumerian Gilgamesh epic. Okay, so they were really classics professor guy. And he immediately came back and corrected me. And he said, well, actually, Homo sapiens is singular. The plural is homines sapientes. That's the proper Latin. And I stuck that in just as a demonstration of, and I footnoted the explanation. It's a classic case of we think we know something and we're wrong, because everybody says Homo sapiens. Everybody thinks that's the plural.
Well, we say slightly different. Homo sapiens.
Yeah, it's a classic case of you think you know something and you don't, and that's exactly what we're facing. Is the wrong information. We got to get to the right information. But it's available on Amazon in the UK.
Fantastic. I'll put that in the descriptions box below.
Thank you.
So, thank you. That has been fascinating. That's been a brilliant chat.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I'm glad I had a good time. You actually got me to go down memory lane on several topics that I hadn't thought of.
That's what it's all about.
It is.
The Tim Heale Podcasts. Ordinary people's extraordinary stories.